So we are happy to have with us on Skype Franklin Foer, the author of the article, the journalist who had spent considerable time also here in Ukraine working on this story. So Frank, thanks a lot. The story is lengthy. There are a lot of details, though we're still thirsty for more, especially connected to what Paul Manafort was doing here. So really, maybe you could give some of the more examples how deeply he was involved not just in advising President Yanukovych, but more or less setting up the policies and maybe some of the activities, and what were they? If we speak about Ukraine and especially the last year of Viktor Yanukovych here.
Right. So he was intimately involved in every aspect of the discussion about the European Union and joining the European Union. That he was involved in brokering discussions between the foreign ministry and Yanukovych. That in the later stages of the Yanukovych administration, Yanukovych closed himself off to his advisors. Everything became about his family, and he stopped even talking to some of his ministers. But Manafort always had this special power to talk to Yanukovych. And so, if, say, the foreign minister wanted to send a message to Yanukovych, he could use Manafort to help send that sort of message. And I have to tell you, just when I was in Kiev and I could see some of the files and parts of, say, like the Ministry of Justice, it was incredible to me the extent to which I could see Paul Manafort and his operation helping to edit press releases and documents, that he wasn't just involved at the highest level in conversations with Yanukovych. It wasn't a superficial relationship, that he was deeply, deeply involved in governing.
In particular, if you speak about the Ministry of Justice, what were those cases?
Well, so I mean, I'm thinking mostly of the Timoshenko case, and that this was one of the primary things that Manafort did for Yanukovych was he tried to help justify the imprisonment of Timoshenko. And so we know about this to a large extent, the way that he worked with Skadden Arps and Greg Craig to try to come up with a legal justification, and then also the way in which he tried to help create better optics, the public relations around her imprisonment. And so that was, I think, one of his major portfolio items.
If we speak about Manafort coming to this country, yes, he was more or less sent by the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, who has some of the assets in this country in the heavy industry. But really, how Manafort got hired by the later the Ukrainian president, with
Right.
whom of the Ukrainian businessmen and oligarchs he was communicating, who actually paid him.
Right. So Manafort came here because he was working for the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, and he came at the very, very end of the 2004 presidential election to help give almost an assessment, an intelligence report to Deripaska about what was happening. And through Deripaska introduced him to Renat Akhmetov, and they developed an independent sort of relationship in the course of the 2004 campaign and during the Orange Revolution. And so Akhmetov helped kind of make this connection to Yanukovych. And so when Yanukovych was in the Czech Republic just after the Orange Revolution, Manafort's team went to go meet with him. And then Yanukovych returned to Kiev and met with Manafort himself, and they developed this relationship that would, sometimes it would have highs, sometimes it would have lows. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but it became a fairly close one. And ultimately, when Yanukovych needed to trust somebody, he would constantly turn back to Paul Manafort.
And if we speak about the amount of money, so how much approximately had been paid? And also, there were other oligarchs like Firtash who were, in the end, having the connections through the administration of the President Yanukovych to Paul Manafort. So, really, what amount of money we are speaking, especially in the last years, and who else paid?
So we don't know, and none of this we know for a fact, right? So we have the Robert Mueller's indictment of of Paul Manafort, and he talks about $75 million being put into the Cyprus accounts, into the Grenadines, and presumably that money came for his work in Ukraine. Some of it came from Oleg Deripaska, but a lot of it came from Ukraine. And so what would happen is that Manafort would go to Sergei Lavochkin, and Lavochkin would go to Yanukovych and say, "Look, Manafort wants $10 million," and so Yanukovych would say, "Okay, let's give him the $10 million," and Lavochkin would go to all the different Ukrainian oligarchs and say, "Here, you owe $1 million, you owe $1 million," and the way that my sources described it is that Lavochkin would then take his own cut of the action. He would take a fee for having collected this money on behalf of Manafort.
And Frank, can you explain also those sums? Because, is it relatively similar in different countries or in DC to pay for a political campaigner like 10 million US dollars? For what that amounts are usually paid? Would the other campaigners and political, spin doctors would get that?
No, and I think that's part of the reason why Manafort was so attracted to Ukraine. When he worked in Ukraine, he dropped all of his other clients because he was making so much money in Ukraine, and there was no other place in the world that he could get the type of fees that he received in Ukraine.
There is a general idea because Manafort hadn't been in the radar during the Euromaidan, during the revolution, and especially when it had become brutal. So, to what extent he was communicating with the former president at that time? Was he coming to Ukraine? What is the evidence for that? Did he continue to communicate with Yanukovych after that? After his exile?
I don't have an answer to that question. I mean, I know that he was not in Kiev during the Euromaidan, and I don't know to what extent he was communicating with Yanukovych during that period. I know that he was genuinely pushing Yanukovych to join the European Union, and I think he may have fallen slightly out of favor when Yanukovych decided to go in the other direction. And so I could only speculate about what sort of communication that they had during that period. But so I can't really answer your question in a concrete way.
In that regard, still, what kind of the president he was making out of the Ukrainian leader Viktor Yanukovych? What kind of policies, you can see were drawn by Manafort? Because there are also during the different times, Yanukovych was playing more, let's say, I can't say more liberal, but let's say more soft. Then would be a tougher version of Yanukovych, more pro-Russian. So what was we can know what was the line of Manafort?
It's a little bit hard to say. I mean, he was not primarily a policy advisor. He was a political advisor, and I do think that there were. You could say that there's some. I know the things that Manafort takes credit for in talking to Americans. So when he's talking to an American audience, he's very proud of himself for pushing for Ukraine to hand over the last remaining remnants of its nuclear arsenal. That he was very proud of pushing for the European Union. But on the other hand, we also know that when the Party of Regions was in opposition, that he was definitely pushing for an anti-NATO position, and that even though he downplays that when he talks to Americans, but he was doing that, and so I think it's a mistake to think about him as a policy person. I mean, he's such a mercenary, and his view of the world is so political that really what he's interested in is his client holding power, maintaining power, winning re-election.
And Frank, you actually your article is so much about the human nature, about the
Yeah.
greed, and that's what seduced Manafort to go and become so much in focus of the U.S. media, joining the Trump campaign. But we would like to really, I think that there are a lot of questions regarding his connection to Oleg Deripaska, especially after he had some of the issue with him, like with not, let's say, with probably spending some of Deripaska money and later even having some legal issues with the Russian oligarch. But later, what we understood, he wanted, when he already had become the advisor to the political campaigner for Donald Trump, he again reached out to Deripaska. Can you elaborate more on really this? How much can we finally know about this Russian connection that everybody looks and maybe sometimes even overdo?
Yeah, no, it's really I don't know what the connection is at the end of the day. I know what his relationship was like with Oleg Deripaska. So that in 2006, 2007, he started to talk about investing in Ukraine with Oleg Deripaska, and indeed they bought a telecommunications company in Odessa called Chornomor. And so they bought this telecommunications company, and then the financial crisis happens, and Deripaska, who once had $28 billion, now needed his money back. And so he asked Manafort to sell the company. And ultimately, Manafort stopped. It seems like he wasn't able to sell the company because there was a question that Deripaska asked, which was, did Manafort even buy the company that he said he was buying with Deripaska's money? And so Deripaska does not like to be cheated. And so he's been after Manafort to get his money back. And as soon as Manafort joined the Trump campaign, he tried to use his new position of power to try to get back into Oleg Deripaska's favor. So he started sending him every press clipping about himself, and he tried to promise Deripaska access to the Trump campaign. Now, we don't know what happened. I mean, it's possible that Manafort's messages to Deripaska never got through. It's possible that Deripaska hated Manafort so much that he would have never accepted his offer to come into the Trump campaign. So that's it. It's just an open question. We don't know the answer to the question for sure.
Frank, so thank you so much about providing that details, which are in particularly valuable in this part of the world. That what was Frank Foer, the author of the article in the Atlantic of the investigation on the Paul Manafort.